Dark Souls 3 is one of the more beloved games in the Soulsborne series, and is often considered one of the best games released in the last 10 years. It has everything a third game in a series needs: more engaging gameplay, interesting areas, unique lore connections and callbacks, and in my opinion, the best boss roster From Software had put out up to that point. I've had previous experience with all of these games before this video, except for Dark Souls 3. So I decided now was the time to finally tick this game off the bucket list and complete the collection. However, it's one thing to beat a game and another to obtain the Platinum Trophy. The experiences could vary, as we'll see. So join me as I Platinum Dark Souls 3. Let's do this. Dark Souls 3 has 43 trophies, including the Platinum. These trophies include reaching all 3 endings, beating every single boss, obtain all sorceries, pyromancies, miracles, rings, and gestures, and join every covenant, as well as deepen my bond with those covenants to acquire a handful of the previously mentioned collectibles. Doing all of this will require at least 3 playthroughs. I'm also expecting a tough time, as I've experienced firsthand how difficult From Software games can be. And while it's not technically required, I will also be completing the DLC, as I'm playing the Fire Fades edition and wanted to experience everything this game has to offer. With that said, I began my journey to platinuming Dark Souls 3. For my first playthrough, I wanted to experience this game blind. Part of enjoying games is the anticipation of what comes next, so I purposefully avoided reading any guides until I rolled credits for the first time. Also, considering how these games normally work, I expected I would need to beat this game more than once anyway. I created my character and got dumped into the tutorial section where I got used to the controls. Not long in, I lit my first bonfire and popped my first trophy. Now, I was in it for the long haul. Shortly afterwards, I encountered the first boss of the game, Iudex Gundyr. He's a good tutorial boss to introduce you to the game, and I did beat him in my first go. Doing so unlocked 2 trophies, one for beating him, and the other one for becoming a host of embers for the first time. Next, I reached the Firelink Shrine. This acts as the main hub area of the game, where we can level up through the Firekeeper and upgrade our weapons, amongst other things. We find out that we must beat the 4 Lords of Cinder to help kindle the first flame. After checking it out for a bit, I used the bonfire in the center to travel to the first world, High Wall of Lothric, and the journey truly began. I made my way through the area, defeating enemies and finding items along the way without much issue. Eventually, I end up in a place called Lothric Castle, where I talk to the woman there and unlock a trophy for joining my first covenant.
Noble blue sentinels.
Nearby, I run into the next boss, Fort of the Boreal Valley. He has one of the most iconic themes in the series, but I take him down pretty easily on my first try and unlock a trophy for doing so. I continue on and come across another item which lets me join the Warrior of Sunlight Covenant, which pops another trophy. Further into Lothric, after some annoying enemies, I found another boss in the form of the Curse-Rotted Greatwood. He's the first boss I lost to the first time around, but did successfully beat him on my second attempt. This in turn popped another boss trophy. I should mention that while I've been exploring, I encountered various NPCs along the way. Some of them sell you things, and others are needed for particular side quests, which will be important later on. One of them is Sigurd of Katarina, who is one of my favourite characters in the whole game. Eventually, I left Lothric and ended up in the Road of Sacrifices. Not long into it, I ran into a couple of NPCs, one of whom is called Anri. She'll be important for one of the endings, but for now, we just talk to her. The other guy doesn't talk, but we do gain another trophy for discovering the Blue Sentinels Covenant. Exploring further into the woods and defeating the numerous enemies along the way, I find the next boss, the Crystal Sage. Again, I lost to her the first time around, but once I understood her new gimmick, I beat her the second time. which unlocked another trophy in the process. I eventually ended up in a poison swamp, although I didn't find this area as bad as other poison areas in FromSoft games. During my time in this game, I made sure to thoroughly explore every area I came across. This swamp was no exception, and I ended up coming across a large dog. Interacting with them popped another trophy for discovering the Watchdogs of Farron Covenant. I made it through the swamp and ended up at the next boss, the Abyss Watchers. These are the first of the 4 Lords of Cinder that we'll need to defeat to reach the end. He was a bit harder than any of the previous bosses I'd faced up to that point, but I did beat him on my 4th attempt, and so I obtained the next boss trophy. This opened up the next area, the Catacombs of Carthus. Despite my struggles in this area with the enemies and the overall level design, I made it to the boss at the end, High Lord Volnir. He's one of the easiest bosses in the game, as all you have to do is destroy his bracelets. Once I did that, I obtained another trophy. High Lord Volnir. After a brief respite at the Firelink Shrine, I next headed to the Cathedral. Here, I encountered one of the most annoying NPCs in the entire Souls series, Patches. As much as I dislike him, he is required for a couple of trophies, so I decided to forgive him when he betrays me. For now. At the end of the cathedral, I discover the boss, Deacons of the Deep. Again, it's a pretty easy boss fight, especially when you see what his gimmick is, as he's just transporting between different enemies and making sure you hit the right one. I dispatch the Deacons and pop another trophy. Continuing on the main path, next up was my favourite area in the game, Irithyll. Visually, it's stunning. This is peak art direction. It's one of my favourite FromSoft areas in any of their games. We progress through the area until we reach a fork in the road, which can lead to 2 potential directions. We'll need to go through both of them to find the remaining Lords of Cinder, but for now I decide to continue through Irithyll until I reach a boss, Pontiff Sullivan. This was the first boss who truly gave me a hard time, especially when you reach his second phase where he creates a clone of himself. For a first encounter, he was the hardest boss in the base game, but after about half an hour, I eventually took him down and obtained another trophy for doing so. I continued through Irithyll until I came across a fake wall and descended a ladder. This took me to another NPC who was part of the Aldrich Faithful Covenant. Hence, I popped another trophy for discovering this covenant. Afterwards, I ascended the area further until I reached Anor Londo, which is definitely a callback to Dark Souls 1. This and Irithyll before is probably the greatest example of From Software's more vertical level design in this game. When it's done well like this, I really enjoy exploring it, and it feels satisfying when you discover shortcuts. This is especially the case when there are runbacks to the bosses you've lost to. Within Anor Londo, I found the next Lord of Cinder, Aldrich, Devourer of Gods. I beat him on my second go and popped another trophy for doing so. After this, I took the other route I mentioned earlier and ended up in Irithyll Dungeons. I will be honest, this is my least favourite area in the game, and it's down to the enemies, which can rapidly reduce your health if they look at you. I'm not joking, they don't even need to touch you. This becomes especially annoying when they appear in groups and one-shot you if you're not quick enough. Combine that with the various traps and you have a recipe for some annoyance. I eventually make it through to the profaned capital, and at the end is the third Lord of Cinder, Yorm the Giant. I beat him on my second go in the dumbest way possible once I found out that there was a much easier way in subsequent playthroughs. The first time around, I just kept trying to hit his arm. This, along with his large amount of health, meant he took a while to drop. This unlocked another trophy. The mistake here was on me, not the game by the way. After beating Yorm, we're immediately transported back to Lothric Castle, where we are automatically put in a fight against the Dancer of the Boreal Valley. She was a bit more interesting than some of the other bosses, but I defeated her on my first go. This in turn popped another trophy. Beating the Dancer opened up a ladder to the higher areas of Lothric Castle. Before exploring that place, I took a side path through the Consumed King's garden. At the end, another boss was waiting for me. This time, it was Osiris, the Consumed King. He wasn't too bad, and I beat him on my first attempt, which of course meant another trophy. Afterwards, I decided to go back to ascend up Lothric Castle. This included dispatching 2 dragons and a few tough enemies, which actually gave me a hard time surprisingly. About halfway up the castle, we find the next boss, Dragon Slayer Armor. After several questionable attempts, I beat him. I actually enjoyed this boss. Again, he's actually a callback to a previous game. Next up was the Grand Archives, which was quite tough with the amount of projectiles enemies would send my way. This was somewhat mitigated by the amount of shortcuts, so it never felt like I was wasting much time on runbacks. Here, and closer to the top of the castle, I found a couple of Titanite slabs, which we have required to fully upgrade a weapon. When I reach a bonfire, I go to the blacksmith in the Firelink Shrine and do just that. This unlocks a trophy for doing so. Shortly afterwards, we reach the final Lord of Cinder, Lothric, Younger Prince. This one actually gave me a difficult time and took me almost an hour to beat. He has 2 phases, and they both include a teleport gimmick along with some magic in the second phase. I am aware that my struggles were a skill issue on my part rather than anything the game was doing. This was just one of those bosses where I just struggled more than a lot of people, despite recognizing his pattern. But I did eventually beat him. With all 4 Lords of Cinder defeated, I decided to tackle the final boss for the first of 3 endings. That boss was the Soul of Cinder, and he is a culmination of everything that's happened in the previous games. He embodies the many souls that keeps the flame going. And in all honesty, he might be my favourite FromSoft final boss, partly due to the story and lore connections. He also gave me a tough time in our first of what would be 3 battles. He has 2 phases. The second one in particular I found to be tough, especially when he does that ridiculous combo that wipes out nearly all of your health. But after about half an hour, I was able to beat him and achieve the first ending. That being to link the first flame ending, where we just keep the fire going for just a bit longer, not bringing the Age of Fire to an end just yet. This first playthrough took over 21 hours to complete. I decided not to jump into New Game Plus and do some cleanup instead. In New Game Plus, the enemies hit harder and take more damage, so I wanted to get as much done as possible before I would have to jump into that. There were a few areas I missed on my first playthrough. The first of them was the Smouldering Lake, which was another reference to Dark Souls 1. This place can be annoying as this ballista is constantly firing at you, and you must manually stop it yourself. At the end of it is the old Demon King boss. I get the feeling that I was over-leveled for this fight as he went down pretty easily. This of course unlocked another trophy. Heading back to the Consumed King's garden, I went through a fake wall at the end of the dungeon and ended up in another area called the Untended Graves. Just discovering this place unlocked another trophy. While taking a break for exploring, I went back to the Firelink Shrine. At the blacksmith, I was able to fully upgrade my Estus Flask, which is the item used to restore health or magic. Doing this popped another trophy. Back to the Untended Graves, I ended up in a rematch with Gundyr, this time called Champion Gundyr. He was definitely harder than his tutorial counterpart, and while he doesn't transform, he is able to perform more deadly combos. It took about half an hour to beat in this run, but once I did beat him, another trophy popped for doing so. I went further and found another variation of the Firelink Shrine. I found a few items, including one which is key to one of the other endings, but I won't worry about that until another playthrough. I also discover an item which allows me to teleport back to bonfires an unlimited number of times. This will be important on a few occasions for different reasons. The final undiscovered area was Archdragon Peak. This was definitely the most difficult to find as it required performing a particular gesture in a specific part of the Irithyll dungeons. Like the Untended Graves, arriving here unlocks a trophy for doing so. Not long after arriving, we encounter the first boss of the area, the Ancient Wyvern. This fight is the definition of a gimmick fight. You don't actually defeat it one-on-one on the ground. You actually have to navigate a route that goes above the Wyvern. with the most difficult challenge being to avoid the numerous enemies along the way. Once you get to the required position, you simply drop down on its head and one-shot it. It's a cool fight. And if you want a tougher dragon fight, you'll get one in the DLC, but more on that later. Progressing through the remainder of Archdragon Peak will eventually bring you to another boss. This time, it's one of the most infamous bosses in the entirety of From Software's library, that being the Nameless King, and his reputation precedes him. His fight is broken into two phases. The first is where he's riding a dragon, and you have to beat it by hitting its head a bunch of times. The second phase is where the real fight begins. He'll come at you from many angles with different attacks. It's definitely an epic fight, and my favourite from the base game. It took me over an hour, but I was finally in a position to defeat him and pop a trophy for doing it. He was the final boss trophy I needed. Next was finding the remaining covenants. Firstly, I crossed an invisible path in Anor Londo to find the Blade of the Dark Moon Covenant.
Thou'rt now a blade, the only knight of swear this oath.
Next, I completed a questline with an NPC called Cirrus to find the Moundmaker Covenant. And finally, after returning to the cathedral from earlier, I found a secret room where I found the Rosaria Fingers Covenant, which in turn unlocked the final Covenant trophy. Sometime later, I found the Undead Bone Shard. As a result, I was able to fully upgrade to the Shrine Bonfire, which also unlocked another trophy. A few minutes later, back at the blacksmith, I obtained another trophy for performing each kind of infusion. All other possible trophies found in this playthrough, now began what many found to be the low point of the Platinum journey, the Covenant grind. As it sounds, it involves most of the Covenants. Most Covenants give you an option to deepen your bond with them. These bonds are deepened by giving a Covenant enough of a particular item, usually 10 and 30. The rewards you gain vary, but some of them are various spells and rings which are required for different trophies. The issues begin when you try to acquire these items. There are two ways you can acquire most of these items. Either through the online mode where you can go into other players' worlds to do something specific, normally helping or killing them. The other is through offline mode by grinding particular enemies and hoping they drop them. The problem is that these items have a particularly low drop rate ranging from 1 to 5%. There are certain items like the Symbol of Avarice which can increase drop rates, but you'll still need to wait a while to acquire the required amount. Now, in online mode, you can boost a couple of these items if you have a friend who's willing to help you, but I don't have any friends who own Dark Souls 3, so I was going to take the long way around and offline. The most infamous of these grinding hotspots is on these stairs in Anor Londo. Here, you can kill these two enemies by the bonfire over and over again in order to find an item called Proof of Concord Kept. Because 30 of them are required, and even with the items that boost your chances of acquiring one, you'll spend hours staring at the same steps grinding these two enemies for hours on end. In my experience, it took me almost 6 hours to farm enough Proof of Concord Kept to fulfill the Covenant requirements, and yes, it was as tedious as it sounds. Even after I had finished, I spent days afterwards thinking about those same stairs. And you know what? I wasn't fond of the grind for the sunlight medals either. In this case, the most effective way is to go to the bonfire in Lothric Castle and kill this same guard over and over again. Once more, 30 sunlight medals are required. The grind for these medals took almost as long as the Proof of Concord Kept did. Combine that with the other Covenant grinds, and you're looking at over 15 hours of grinding to complete them all. And that's over 2/3 of my first playthrough just to beat the game. I agree with the general consensus that this was the lowest point of the game for me, and I was in even more growing miserable state the longer the grind went on. This point was the closest I had had to quitting the Platinum journey altogether, but as the old saying goes, in for a penny, in for a pound, and was determined enough not to stop after all the time I had put in so far. So I gritted my teeth and continued to farm these items for hours at a time. Honestly, I was popping off whenever one of these items did drop. I genuinely felt like I had been sent to Purgatory, and especially at the beginning, I wondered if there was any way I could actually finish this. Ironically, the only possible exception was the final item, the vertebra shackle. Offline, you can grind the item from skeletons in the catacombs. After about half an hour where only 2 dropped during that time, I decided to stop and just invade players online. Each grind took over a minute, which is the longest of any item, and after 15 hours, I couldn't be bothered to do another monotonous routine. At least going online would be something different. Despite me losing more invasions than I won, I was at least having somewhat fun. The community around this game is still active, especially during the weekends, so I was able to invade other worlds at a good rate. You can gain a vertebra shackle if an invaded player dies. It doesn't even have to be you who kills them. But in all honesty, some players did end up dying in some funny ways. To any players I killed when I invaded them, I just want to say I'm sorry, and thank you for helping me in the Platinum journey. Hopefully, you completed Dark Souls 3 too. After a few hours, I did eventually acquire enough vertebra shackles and completed the final Covenant request. When I handed in the vertebra shackles, I actually acquired the final pyromancy, which unlocked another trophy for doing that. So once again, apologies and thank you to all those online players. On the bright side, I also gained millions of souls while grinding, so I was able to level up a lot when all was said and done. Before I went into New Game Plus, I decided to take on the DLC worlds since I was going for everything. The first of those was the Ashes of Ariandel, where we were transported into a new area that was mostly snowy. This area was fine, but the boss at the end was the best part, Sister Fried. There are 3 phases and the third one is definitely the most challenging. Sister Fried gains a whole load of new attacks and can do major damage to you, and I definitely suffered for a while doing this. But after 20 minutes, I was finally able to defeat her and complete the Ashes of Ariandel. There was another boss against a man and a wolf too, but I thought they were pretty forgettable. The next DLC was the Ringed City. I wasn't a fan of the first part due to the number of projectiles being fired at you, and when I reached the first boss, the Demon Prince, he absolutely mauled me on the first few goes to the point where I had to stop and take a break. After composing myself, I came back and eventually dealt with him. This led to the second half of the DLC, which contains 2 of the most memorable bosses in the entire game. The first is Slave Knight Gale, who became my favourite boss in the entire Dark Souls trilogy. This is honestly an epic showdown against the 2 strongest beings in the world, and I wouldn't want it any other way. He hits hard, and he definitely ups the ante as you deplete his health. It's very easy to die here. I know I was a bit lucky as I beat him on my second attempt, but he's still a wonderful boss. Second of those bosses is Dark Eater Midir. If you thought the Ancient Wyvern was an underwhelming dragon boss, Dark Eater Midir is the complete opposite. From my point of view, he was the hardest in the entire game. Not only does he have a lot of HP, making him very tanky, you can really only deal proper damage to him by hitting his head, meaning that there is a limited window of opportunity to strike. Pair that with a gallery of devastating attacks, and you have one truly formidable boss for the ages. After an hour of trying, I was finally able to beat him and officially defeated all of the DLC bosses. One thing to note is that despite how challenging I found some of the bosses, I never found them to be unfair. For me, the balance was perfect. Any deaths during these fights I could chalk up to skill or timing issues on my part. From Software's designed their games so well that you can beat them in multiple ways despite their challenges. Every enemy in Dark Souls 3 can be defeated. It's a case of pattern recognition. You will always have an opportunity to strike and kill any enemy. It's always fair despite my own struggles. For me, this is the mark of phenomenal gameplay and why From Software are contenders for one of the best game developers in the world currently. And when you overcome the challenge and win against more comfortably later against bosses, it wasn't because the game got easier, you got better. You overcame a challenge and came out the other side better for it. Hell yeah. After clearing up everything possible in my first playthrough, I dove straight into New Game Plus. My goal for the playthrough was to pursue the Usurper of Fire ending, as well as finding any available sorceries, miracles, rings, and gestures along the way. Both of these tie together, as there are a handful of those only accessible via pursuing the Usurper of Fire ending. I chose to go for this ending as it is the most difficult to achieve due to having very specific requirements. Most of those requirements involve doing quest lines for the NPCs Yol, Yuria, and Anri, who you'll find at specific points in the game. I'll also have to advance their quest lines before defeating particular bosses. as well as not healing myself from the dark sign needed for this ending once I attain it. Luckily, I have already beaten this game once. It was easier to know what to look out for on my second playthrough. As a result, I was making pretty short work of a lot of the areas, and in all honesty, I found New Game Plus to be pretty easy. It was probably due to pattern recognition, since the bosses and enemies don't switch their attack patterns in New Game Plus. I made sure to save souls from defeated bosses to trade with Ludeth, the one Lord of Cinder who stuck to his duty for specific rings and spells. I also made sure to trade with any vendors I missed on my first playthrough to gain the necessary items. Eventually, after several hours, I ended up back in Irithyll again right before the Pontiff Sullivan boss fight. I summoned an NPC to help me fight him called Blackhand Gothard, and he gave me the final gesture I was missing, which in turn popped another trophy for finding all the gestures. After fighting Pontiff Sullivan, I continued up through Irithyll and went to a secret area to complete an important moment in obtaining the Usurper of Fire ending. This involved a wedding to the now deceased Anri, who I'd been working with at different points in the story. But now we had to continue this questline by stabbing a sword into her. After the ceremony ended, I left the hall and found the last sorcery waiting for me outside. I picked it up and required a trophy for attaining all sorceries. Afterwards, I continued through the story, including defeating Yorm the correct way by completing Siegward's questline. I would then defeat the Dancer of the Boreal Valley again to acquire a soul, before trading it with Ludeth for the final miracle, Soothing Sunlight. And, as expected, I popped a trophy for finding all the miracles. These were all the collectible related trophies I could attain in New Game Plus, so I advanced the story looking out for any remaining rings. Finding as many as possible would make New Game Plus cleanup easier. I didn't have any issues with the remaining bosses and defeated the Soul of Cinder again. This playthrough was definitely shorter than my first one, but I was taking specific times at this point. I interacted with the bonfire and got the Usurper of Fire ending. This is pretty much the bad ending in which we basically become the Dark Lord. It's an interesting ending and I popped a trophy for getting it. With everything possible I could do for the platinum on this run done, it was time for New Game Plus. I was now on the home stretch. There were only 2 remaining trophies. They were for finding all of the rings and achieve the final ending, the End of Fire. There were a handful of rings which could only be gained in the third playthrough, so I wasn't bothered by it. The requirements of the End of Fire ending also aren't as specific as the Usurper of Fire, so I wasn't expecting much, which is pretty much what happened. I simply sped around the game, picking up any remaining rings along the way, which weren't many. Once again, the bosses didn't pose much of a challenge as I had all the patterns memorized and mastered by then. The main requirement for the final ending meant going to the untended graves and making it to the Firelink Shrine in that area. Here, there's an item called the Eyes of the Firekeeper, which we need to give to the Firekeeper in the regular Firelink Shrine. Again, it wasn't too difficult to find, as it's just behind an invisible wall I found on my first playthrough. I gave them to the Firekeeper and I was on course for that ending. You know that's the ending you're headed towards if the music that plays when you're in the Firelink Shrine changes. I was also making good progress in attaining the remaining rings. Towards the end, the only remaining rings required involved another showdown with the Nameless King, and it did feel like an epic fight as always. But since this was the third time I had faced him at this point, I was able to beat him on my second attempt. With the Nameless King down for the last time, all that was left was to pick up the final ring, and the trophy for finding all of them would pop. That just left the trophy for the final ending, and one more showdown with the Soul of Cinder. I had fulfilled all the requirements for the End of Fire ending, and was ready to finish this. I went to the kiln of the first flame and took on the final boss one more time. With the Soul of Cinder finally down for the last time, I actually don't interact with the bonfire. Instead, I use the summon sign nearby to summon the Firekeeper who finally puts out the flame, bringing with it the Age of Darkness. This is my favourite ending as it feels the most natural, as it's just the nature of the world running its course. It also points to future optimism, as the Firekeeper hints that another flame will begin again at some point in the future, which is nice to hear. It reminds me of the different time periods before, during and after the dark ages of our own history. There's always hope in the darkest hours. Anyway, with the final ending achieved, the final trophy popped, the platinum popped, and my journey was over. After all of that, was Dark Souls 3 worth platinuming? In all honesty, not really. This is entirely down to the Covenant grinds, as I don't think the payoff is worth it. They completely dragged down what was mostly a phenomenal experience up to that point. However, it is absolutely worth playing through from beginning to end. I even think it's worth doing multiple times to achieve every ending. In fact, when you're just playing the game normally from beginning to end, Dark Souls 3 is my favourite game of the trilogy. I could definitely recommend playing it in that regard, and it is still one of the best games released in the last decade. Thank you for watching this video, you absolute legend, and good luck on your gaming journey. Be sure to like and subscribe.